I think we can start. Good afternoon. Una cosa in italiano, questo panel è in inglese senza traduzione. Good afternoon, my name is Laura Cappon. I'm an Italian journalist and I worked for 4 years in Cairo, where I covered the democratic transition after Tahrir Square revolution. And today we are here to speak about what we call the Arab winter, and everyone here got upset about this definition. Now we will explain why. Because, 80 years after the so-called Arab Spring, the Middle East has had to come to terms with even more ferocious dictatorship than before. We had the case of assassination of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and this case has shown that Western nations continue to maintain relations with authoritarian regimes in the region. Today we are speaking about this issue with Iyad El-Baghdadi. He's a prominent activist, with Anwar al-Bunni. He's a Syrian human rights lawyer, and with Safa al-Ahmad. She's a Saudi journalist. So shall we start with why we are not in the Arab winter? So Safa, if you want to start.
You don't want to start with me.
Okay. Please, yeah.
No, I actually want to see what Safa would say.
We had a long, very angry lunch to discuss why we hated the term Arab winter. And to me, it goes into what we were discussing, what we want to discuss in this session about the failure of media in general and how they covered what's going on in the region post-2011. And winter, and the word is such a Orientalist bullshit term that covers all manner of sins of lack of understanding of the complexities of the region. And I feel like it's also a really demeaning term to say, oh, look at the poor Arabs, they tried to revolt and they failed, and now they're in this winter that they started the summer. And so it's part of the bigger discourse of the failure of how people have covered the Middle East in general, but specifically the events post-2011. And if you allow me, I'll speak a little about how in Saudi Arabia, how that reflected. And for example, So the protests in Saudi Arabia started, like with everywhere else in the Arab world, in February of 2011. And it took me about 2 years to get commissioned to be able to cover and do a documentary about the protests that were going on, not just in the eastern province, which proved to be the longer of the protests that were going on in the region, but also in places like Breda, where women had actually started revolting and protesting in the streets, demanding the release of their husbands and sons and children who were accused of terrorism at the time. And so that was like this perfect moment that joined with everything else in the region of people wanting to have reform and change. It started with reform, and then everybody was like, everything needs to fall. And so, but when it came to the narrative of how they wanted to cover Saudi Arabia, nobody wanted to talk about the people of Saudi Arabia. Everybody was fucking obsessed with the royals. Everybody wanted to talk about the king, the princes, what's going on in the palace. Everybody's obsessed with the access to royalty, right? And this is most of the problems of how Saudi Arabia is being covered. Sorry, I curse a lot, so if anybody's they can leave. And so, but that's to me part of the lack of understanding of what's going on in the country. And this is part of like the whole thing of the surprise of what's going on now. And so to me, it was quite indicative because I covered all the other countries. I was in Libya, I was in Tunis, I was in Egypt, I was in Yemen, I was in Bahrain. I did not cover Syria. But parts of for me, what hurt is that I felt the need to go back to Saudi Arabia and cover what was going on there. But nobody was interested in what the people were doing. Everybody was interested in the royalty, as if they no longer existed. The same thing with Libya, with the trouble of Libya's Gaddafi, and Gaddafi is Libya, right? And so all of a sudden everybody's surprised that there are people there besides Gaddafi. And so to me, this is the struggle with how we are presented in the media, how Saudis are presented in the media. And then when they finally discovered that there were people in Saudi Arabia, it was, how do I put it? This obsession with saving the Saudi woman, the poor, oppressed Saudi woman. And this is why I think there was a lot of traction and obsession with when we were banned from driving, right? Everybody wanted to do that documentary. If I wanted to do that documentary, everybody would have commissioned it. But because I wanted to do the bigger context of the human rights violations in the country, nobody wanted to do that. And so to me, this is, how do you talk about misogyny, oppression, dictatorship, all these things within the Arab context without falling into these traps of the Orientalism, of the wanting to save the woman? And there is no space, at least in the mediums that I work in, to have a more nuanced, complex conversation about what's going on. So then we no longer are people reading what's going on in the Middle East and being surprised, you know, that what people actually are dealing with on the ground. And for example, even like yesterday, the Saudis released 3 of the women temporarily, and now they've arrested Salah, Aziza's son, and a whole bunch of other people with them. And so there's this like cat and mouse game between the regime and the people themselves. Nobody knows anymore who will be arrested, who will be released, and then arrested again, and everybody's like playing guessing games of like, what are the red lines now, and how do we maneuver? So yeah. That's my problem with the Arab winter.
Yeah.
Quite an introduction to the panel. I want to note, though, that people who demand a kind of orderly, perfect, idealistic transition of Arabs don't really remember what Europe's transition to democracy looked like. We're talking about 2 world wars, 100 million people dead. So I think a lot of the time with these kind of, you know, Orientalisms, and to be honest, I don't even like the word Orientalism itself. I feel like the word Orientalism itself is Orientalist. Yeah.
We can't win.
But the reason I want to touch up on why this is important. The reason why it's important is because the policing of language is just one step away from the policing of thought. And this is really framing the discussion about framing the entire conversation about the Arab world and the future of the Arab world. The reason why this is important is because we're really in a fight over the future. And the more people get convinced what the future look like to them, whoever they are, they're going to start, like, for example, if we have enough people convinced that into the future, 10 or 20 years, the status of the Arab world is going to be, let's say, dictatorship. They're going to be like, okay, if that's going to be the future for the next 10 or 20 years, we better get used to it. And that's going to start a complete shift. Companies will say, you know what, we don't want to be locked out of this market for 20 years. Let's talk to these dictators. Security companies, policymakers, foreign policy, even journalists, etc. They start to lose, we start as Arabs to lose control over the narrative, over our own narrative, how we are being discussed. Laura started the conversation by saying that we are seeing a level of repression which is more ferocious than ever before. And I think I just want to leave it at this point because I think this is where I think, this would be a conversation that I would enjoy. Look, the reason why these guys are ferocious is because they're paranoid. And the reason why they're paranoid is because they're scared. Their hysteria is driven by paranoia. If you are a confident dictator, you don't need to be paranoid. I mean, people ask, what is the perfect model of tyranny? And some people point, for example, to Assad before 2011 or to Gaddafi before 2011. I think it's actually Mubarak. Mubarak was kind of like the perfect situation of a dictator who doesn't need to be that dictatorial. He doesn't need to be that repressive. And he can be a Western ally, throughout all of that. And he can play with politics. He can basically, have his own tamed opposition. So he had a good thing going. The very fact that, the Arab people, Egyptians, managed to get rid of him in 2011 is a sin that, by the way, the Saudis and the Emiratis still do not forgive. And they're still looking for the next Mubarak. And there won't be probably a next Mubarak because the Egyptian, especially in the Egyptian case, you see a hysteria which is really never, I mean, I don't think Egypt has seen this level of repression in its modern history. So I think this is an important discussion. What is the horizon of political possibility in the Arab world? And I think if you look at a snapshot of what we see right now, if we counted, for example, beginning of 2018 till now, look how many waves of mass protests we saw in the Arab world. Syrians are still protesting, by the way. We've had protests in Iraq, in Jordan, in Sudan, of course, Algeria, in the Rif, in Morocco. There are also protests in Tunisia.
And Yemen.
Sorry?
Yemen.
And Yemen, of course.
Gaza.
And Gaza, of course, the Grand Return March. Anybody who says it's over doesn't know what they're talking about. At the same time, if you look at the exact ecosystem, you see breakage, refugee waves, civil war, interstate wars, and of course this kind of, I don't know how to describe Saudi Arabia because really you're also seeing kind of, 33, 34-year-old idiot who spent billions and a lot of time on this PR image that he's basically a reformer, and then he pissed it away. I don't know, this mentality that you can throw money at anything. You can just, whatever problem, just throw money at it. There's a limit, there's a limitation to that. This kind of combination where you have resistance and popular uprising, but at the same time you have all of the other problems on the table, this is going to be, I think this is what we're looking for the next 5 years or so. And this is what a transition looks like. This is what I want you to understand. This is what a democratic transition looks like. This is the most realistic vision for a transition.
Anwar.
Thank you. I think it's not about Arabian Spring. It's about a word spring. If we look, its wave of this spring start maybe at 1990 when the Berlin Wall fall. It start from there. The people feel we deserve democracies. And it's continue to 2004, 2005, Ukraine, Georgia, and arrived to Arab countries because the people feel we deserve to be human. And this is still spring and will continue for others, dictatorship or people who until now they didn't find chance to start their spring like Saudi Arabia and Emirates and others. It will continue. This spring, and I disagree with Laura about called it winter, it's still go on. And it succeed in West Europe, in East Europe, because West Europe contain and adopt and support. But unfortunately, they don't feel or find the others need same support. Until now, Ukraine and Georgia have problem with Russia, and they didn't have the full and real support from the Europe. In Tunisia, they maybe will fail because they haven't find full support from the European. They failed in Egypt, and I am sure they will restart again, and they made all the problem and terrorism, people send it to Syria and others to make, it's terrorism movement, and somebody speak about these people don't ready to have democracies. They excuse or say like that to save their face, maybe, or don't support. This spring will continue for sure. And these people deserve to be like you. We are in Syria, deserve, and in Saudi Arabia and in other countries, deserve as a human, to live as a human, respect our rights, respect our humanity. That's what we try to have it. Unfortunately, all the world standing against our will, our hope, our dream. It's this conference and others. I know there is many propaganda about what happened in Arab Spring, about how much terrorism, about the paranoia from Islamic or like that, blah, blah. Many of propaganda after it, huge money, huge state, huge establishment, media establishment, to let the other, these people, this society don't deserve, don't ready to have democracies, and let the dictatorship control them. And really, they establish to future dark for all of us, because the feeling of people, when they feel they deserve to have something, they will have it at last. But it will be a big and huge price for all of us if we don't find the way, the real way, the right way to live all of us in same planet. Same.
Thank you. By the way, I hope that I think you deserve to be better than us, but this is my talk. There is one common point in the Arab countries after 2011, and this is the exile. Many activists had to leave their countries after the revolts, and I think that your stories are very interesting about this point. Can you tell us your story?
It's also something me and Anwar were discussing over lunch. In Arabic, it's غربة, تغريبة, and Anwar is the eternal optimist, obviously.
Hope in bag. Hope in bag.
Yeah, because I was saying the thing inside Saudi Arabia, even when I was in Saudi Arabia, I think a lot of us felt like strangers. We were estranged. I think this is the byproduct and some of the quite deliberate attempt of a dictatorship to make you feel isolated. And that's part of the struggle inside Saudi Arabia. Like, even when the protests were happening in a town next to you, you didn't know anything about it yourself. You were isolated. There's no local independent journalism inside of Saudi Arabia. And so all of that fed into this sense of isolation. Everybody felt like they were struggling on their own. No connection between us. What's happening in the eastern province is disconnected from the west. Even the activists weren't really talking that much. And so when people like me and many others after, there were different waves of us, and I think this is a historical high record of Saudis who've asked for political asylum in Canada and in Germany and in many other countries. And it's actually quite a frightening moment where we still are isolated and feel estranged. And what Anwar was saying is Saudi Arabia is Syria in the 80s, as in we are still quite isolated from the people on the ground inside Saudi Arabia, that there's still that wave of overwhelming desire for change hasn't yet come to a crescendo. Even with Jamal Khashoggi's murder, you could see even within families, and this goes into, the whole thing about how Saudi Arabia is covered in the media, right? Saudi Arabia has, when it's covered in the media, in the Western media, there are two extremes. Saudi Arabia is backward, disgusting, dictatorship, misogyny, all of that oppressive stuff, or this is an amazing country where everything is happening and reform and everything's brilliant. And so you get the two extremes of what Saudi Arabia is, and neither one is a real representation of what's going on inside Saudi Arabia. And so part of the people who live inside Saudi Arabia have this protective thing. It's like, this must be a lie, because there's so many lies against Saudi Arabia. So much of the coverage is not really true reflection of how we experience Saudi Arabia, which is something I understand, and I struggle with when I do cover Saudi Arabia, of fitting into those stereotypes, right? And so there was this defensiveness. But this is also the isolation of it. Like, dictatorships are so successful and fucking with your head about what you are, the gaslighting of society, basically. Of you don't even no longer understand what is true and what isn't because of the mechanism of protection that the government itself has instilled in you. We're talking about Anwar when you were saying about terrorism. The laws, especially after passed in Saudi Arabia specifically, but in many countries in the Arab world, when they're equating political protests with terrorism, with journalism with terrorism. Inside Saudi Arabia, atheism is terrorism. I mean, how ridiculous is this, right? And so you no longer know what your boundaries are. And part of that, so to me, the feeling of exile started way before I even left Saudi Arabia. And to go back to the answer. And this is part of, I think, all of us are struggling with this. Where do we belong? And even when we leave our countries, what is our role? How do we continue doing what we're doing? At least for me, I think everyone has a different experience, but for me, I struggle with this a lot of what is my role now and how I relate to what's going on in Saudi Arabia.
Iyad.
Well, it's a difficult question because it's just so existential. I mean, your sense of belonging and your sense of identity are the two deepest questions you can ever ask yourself. It's basically, who am I and why am I here? It's the most existential question ever. And I actually do have a story about that actually involves Italy, because I remember this was 2016, the first time I spoke at the Perugia International Journalism Festival. And a day before that, I spent a day in Rome to meet my publisher, who, I mean, I just returned to, like, a few days ago from Rome because I went on the tour because the book has been released. It's been published in Italian. So it seemed like it's kind of a homecoming feeling. But I remember that day, there was a beautiful park in Rome, and I'm sitting there, like, I got there, I think, an hour early, so I thought, let me just go for a walk. And if you don't know the background, 2016 was, my family was basically all over the world. I was still struggling to kind of reunite with them. I was expelled from my country in 2014. I lived in the United Arab Emirates my entire life. I'm Palestinian originally, but I've never lived there. I've never lived in any other country than the United Arab Emirates. But then we have family all over the Middle East, and I've always, you grew up with this kind of very, very complex identity, and the question of belonging is always on your mind. It's almost as if, I kind of describe it as a toothache. I mean, normally you're not aware of your tooth, right? Like, nobody really is aware of his tooth until the tooth starts aching. That's when you're very aware of your tooth. In a similar way, you're very aware of your identity when your identity is lacking. I mean, Safa, when I asked her, like, where do you live? And she says, Watani Haqiba, which means my homeland is a suitcase. This is actually from Mahmoud Darwish, from Palestinian poet. And the original is Ahiya Jurhiya al-Mukabar Watani laysa Haqiba. It says my homeland is not a suitcase. Funny thing, Safa, this is exactly on Nakba Day 2014. I was stuck in an airport. I lived in an airport for a month because I had literally nowhere to go after I was expelled. And I remember sharing this as a picture because I was walking around with 2 suitcases all over the airport, and I had no idea where I'm going to end up. Of course, worried about my family, etc. And I remember sending this to a bunch of my friends, saying, "Ah, ya jurhi al-mukabar watani laysa haqiba." And for the next 2 years, until I came to Rome, I didn't own anything that cannot fit in a suitcase. And I remember on that particular day, Ala Abdel Fattah, one of the most iconic activists of the Arab Spring, of the Egyptian uprising, he was put in jail a few months before I was put in jail in the United Arab Emirates. But then he served 5 years, he just came out. I was free. And I asked myself that day, you're in Rome, it's a beautiful day, it's like, I live in Oslo now, so like the weather is never this great, right? And I asked myself, would you rather be home? Would you rather be home? They're going to imprison you, they're going to torture you, etc. Or would you rather be here in Rome? And I was just overcome with this feeling, and I just started to cry. And my answer was no. I'd rather be home. I'd rather be with my comrades, even if I'm in jail. And Ala's story I haven't contacted him yet because it's just so hard. Every time I was going to give up, I thought, what will Ala say? He was in jail for 5 years. What were you fucking doing with your freedom? What were you doing with your freedom? So exile, this is exile. Exile basically is survivor's guilt. Exile is saying, I'd rather be in jail than not do anything. And since I don't want to be in jail, I'm more useful for the world working my ass off. This is what exile is. Exile basically means that you never leave. Your cause becomes your identity. And I think this is like the thing about your cause becoming your identity is really I think it's really a message that we all need, because there's so many movements in the world today that are focused on identity as origin. Like people are digging, it's like we're digging through layers of our history because we want to see what is our origin, because it's like we want to know who we are. We want to look at our origin. And I don't think that's useful at all. I think it's more important for us to look at our future of our identity, our common future, our common destiny. I think that's a more powerful way to relate. Thank you. I see so many wet eyes in the audience, and I think many people relate.
Anwar.
I will speak about my experience. I decided to be lawyers to have this mission, or this life, in fact, from 1986. And it's start really when Berlin Wall fall. It start to feel spring will coming. And after 2000, when Hafiz died, and we start something must to change in Syria. That times, many human rights activities, civil society start to be more activity and start to establish something with Syrian society. That times, Bashar faced it with many pressures. He put many people in jail, torture, more, until 2005, the Lebanon's revolution also, and the pink in revolution in Ukraine, and everybody feel excited, something will happen. They put me in jail 5 years. Until I was in jail, I draw the future of Syria, because I believe the spring start and nothing will stop it. When it started in Tunisia, and after that in Egypt, I was in jail that time, still in jail. And somebody asked me, will be arrived to Syria? I told him, it's like tsunami. If we will not be in the center of this tsunami, the waves will be reach you. So it will be arrived to Syria, and it will be arrived to everywhere. Have hope it will be arrived to Saudi Arabia soon. It's not so long. Because like this tsunami from freedom, nothing will stop it. I am sure about that. And really, after I go out jail, the revolution in Syria start, we involve more and more. Unfortunately, whole the military machine forced the civilian peaceful movement in Syria. The civilian activities who have water and rose flowers to soldier, the soldier killed them in front of cameras. The authority used all the weapon it had, chemical, plane, everything you can imagine. Maybe just nuclear weapon they didn't use in Syria. And the most dangerous weapon was terrorism. They intervention the terrorism people from European, from Turkish, from Saudi Arabia, from all, it's circle from criminals and dictatorship. They want to defend about themselves. So they try to describe Syrian movement as Yemen, as Tunisia. It's Islamic movement. It's terrorism. It will be danger. And unfortunately, the politic in the West, maybe they believe or not, maybe their economy interest leads them to stand against peaceful movement. Until now, Syrian paid 500,000 at least people, victims, civilian. I speak about civilian people who die in Syria. I don't speak about hundreds or more fighters. 30% of Syrian building destroyed. 3 million Syrian child haven't learned in school, education. And until now, the world still watching, do nothing. But unless all of this, I never lost my hope and my faith. The spring will continue. How it's be the price? The world paid 60 million victims because one person, his name Hitler, was in Germany and want to control. I don't know, somebody speak about, okay, maybe we can make peace or stop the war with the criminals in Syria. I ask them, why you didn't make deal with Hitler and save 60 million victims that times? And you ask us now to make deal with the criminals because there is 500,000 victims in Syria. It's a big question in front of all of us. Can we make deal with criminals against humanity and war crimes?
So we have still 10 minutes. I would like to ask you, Safa, about the media coverage, Western media coverage of Saudi Arabia. Do you think the media coverage you were talking before is damaging the work of human rights activists in Saudi Arabia?
I think the Saudi government is damaging the human rights activists. I think it's more complex than that. I think there's a failure in understanding what's actually going on the ground in Saudi Arabia. And so, for example, so many of the journalists, when they come into Saudi, they stay in Jeddah, they stay in Riyadh, they don't leave the cities. Nobody knows what's going on outside the city centers. And I think there is a lack of understanding in the layers of what is actually happening inside Saudi Arabia. I mean, me and some friends were discussing, it's like, what's the relationship between the tribes right now and the Saudi government, and especially with Mohammed bin Salman's very unique leadership skills, and how different it is from King Abdullah and his relationship with the different regions. But nobody knows. Like, everybody is playing this guessing game. We're all reading the tea leaves of what is actually happening in the country because of this lack of understanding. And so I think it's problematic. I don't know if it can damage anything that's already damaged on the ground, right? Because we don't have independent journalism in Saudi Arabia to counterbalance the coverage that is coming from outside. And so I think what is the challenge is how to understand what's going on in the country when there is absolutely no freedom whatsoever to understand. Because even if you are, as a journalist, it was one of the hardest things to get people to talk, because they no longer know what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable to say and not end up in jail, right? And so there's like, even now where we're talking, somebody asked me, it's like, so how many political prisoners are there right now in Saudi Arabia? I don't know. No one knows. Because the families are too afraid to even tell anyone that their loved one has gone missing, that they've been arrested, because everybody hopes that if I shut up, if I don't say anything, maybe the government will release them. Maybe they won't torture them. Maybe it will torture them just a little. Maybe, and so it is, I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities to how Bashar al-Assad has been dealing with a lot of the prisoners. There's so much fear that you have no information, you have no understanding of how they're thinking even. And so we are all blind, basically. We have no understanding of what's going on inside the country. And everybody is just baffled by it. I mean, like Iyad was saying, this Mohammed bin Salman is not stupid, I think. I think he reads things correctly. He's gotten away with killing Jamal Khashoggi. He has. And he has not misread that. He knew exactly what the United States would do. He knew exactly what Trump would do. He knew that companies are going to withdraw for a few weeks and then everybody's going to come back because it's too much money. I mean, we were talking about La Scala here, but actually they didn't give the money back because they had a political stance against Saudi Arabia. It was just a misunderstanding.
They gave the money back,
yeah.
yes.
But so we're talking about people, he read it right. He wasn't wrong at all.
About this topic, in your last book, you wrote that European countries, Western countries in general, they have a complicated relation with the Arab dictatorship. Could you please explain?
Well, with the comparison, I mean, the comparison between Assad and MBS is really, I mean, this is a good place to start the discussion. The difference between Assad and MBS is that MBS is a Western ally. Assad is not. Similarly, Saddam was an ally for a while, and then they turned against each other. Same with Gaddafi, kind of went the opposite direction. Look, the thing about engaging dictators is that the expression that costs are socialized but profits are privatized. This is kind of the situation here, because when it comes to making the profits of these engagements, these are privatized. When it comes to the cost, which is refugee relief, which is security measures, which is terrorism, budgets, which is spending on the military, these are all socialized. So as a result, you're actually paying, every one of you is paying, but there are profits made. The profits are not made by you. They're trying to convince you that, yeah, I mean, there's basically a lot of jobs are going to be created, etc. That's not how it works. But that's kind of the complicated relationship. Of course, the relationship also can go in the reverse, because sometimes the Western governments might be. I mean, a typical example is news that broke a few days ago about Netanyahu, one of his relatives having made a lot of business with Libya, with Gaddafi, before 2010. A lot of that money, basically a lot of those profits were made by Netanyahu himself. So you have the situation where he made something like 700% profit on his shares in whatever company that was. So you have the situation where he's making money from the very dictators that he claims are the worst existential enemies of his own country. And by the way, this is not counterintuitive. This is by design. It's by design, because when you have an enemy, you actually need an enemy. Principle number one for dictatorship is dictators need enemies. They need enemies internally, and they need enemies externally. And external enemies come in two flavors. Enemies that you will never ever wage war on. This is why, for example, Bashar needs Israel, because he's never going to fire a bullet at Israel. But it's very convenient to have. But at the same time, they need a hot enemy. They need an enemy where you can bomb once in a while. This is why Saudi Arabia needs Qatar, by the way. So this is the situation. This is the complicated relationship. And so long we have this relationship continuing, I think there's kind of an impasse on foreign policy. So we had George W. Bush, whose foreign policy was basically based upon invading everywhere and, like bringing democracy, through the barrel of the gun. And then we had Obama, who wasn't, by the way, I believe Obama is a decent human being privately, but when it comes to his foreign policy, it was disastrous. Just as Anwar said, the world broke Syria, but then Syria broke the world. If it wasn't for Syria, two of the things that Trump really needed to win his elections, of course, he didn't really win. He lost the popular vote, which we need to keep reminding ourselves of that. But two things he needed two things that really helped his narrative is ISIS, the existence of ISIS, saying I'm going to be the one who's going to defend you. And number two, refugees. And I'm going to be the one who defends you from refugees. And of course, we have the Russian intervention. All three happened on Obama's watch. So you have, on the one hand, a foreign policy that says, let's bomb, and that's the way to go around. And there's a foreign policy that says, let's shake hands with dictators and pat them on the back and hope they're going to behave themselves. This is an impasse, I think, which really needs some work. And this is actually one of the reasons why I wrote the book, about how do we design a progressive foreign policy. If you have people who are progressive on healthcare, progressive on women's rights, progressive on education, progressive on inequality, what is a progressive foreign policy? And this is the big question.
Okay, we have 10 minutes. If there is any question. Wait for the microphone.
Hello, I'm Hussein. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm working in Turkey since 5 years. I'm from Iraq. For me, the Arab Spring started 20 years before 2011. It started in Iraq, 1991, but no one even mentioned this because of Saddam Hussein, when he killed many of Iraqi peoples, still a hero for many of Arabs. I covered the war in Syria. It's against dictator like Bashar, but I saw Saddam's pictures on the cars of FSA. I cannot understand this. So, same party, same idea, but this is
in
dictator.
Yemen as well, by the way.
Yeah, this is dictator, and this is like a good dictator. This is not a question, just following up. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephanie from change.org in Italy. First of all, you're all my heroes, and I have just so much love and admiration for all that you're doing and struggling with. I think you raised a very important question at the end about what does progressive foreign policy look like. And one of the things that I notice is really missing is the concept, in human rights, you listen to the people who are the most affected and you take your lead from what they're doing ordinarily. How do we do that? Like, how do we listen better? To whom do we listen? How do we sort of structure that? Because I think it's also a question that goes to the heart of journalism as well.
Should I say my question and then you answer? Oh, okay. I'm Wafa Al-Badri. I'm originally from Egypt, but I'm based in Berlin. It's an introduction for the question. So now we are in Egypt. We become very, very happy, which is our right when some activists or one activist is out of the prison. However, we know that the fight is still very, very long to get the others from the prison, and then the revolution turned not only to be getting more advanced rights, but just to get them out of the prison. My question here, we are now living in the West, we are now living in Europe. And my question is to all of you, how do you see the West should or must help us to end these dictatorships in our countries?
We can start with the answers.
So on the question of Saddam, allow me to start. On the question of Saddam in 1991, I just want to add some context, which is very important for people to understand. When the Iraqi people rose in 1991, it was after, so it came at the same time that George Bush Sr. was encouraging them to protest. So he encouraged them to protest. They rose. Saddam lost, I think, all but one government. He lost control of almost all of Iraq. And then the very Western leader he basically said, I support your protest, watched and stood by as Saddam killed 100,000 Iraqis. And this is one example. Imagine what the Middle East would look like if in 1991 we had a democratic Iraq. Imagine that. Just imagine what the future would look like. Imagine if we didn't have to have 2003, we didn't have to have 2014 with Daesh, etc. It's a story of disaster, and I don't blame any Iraqi for being bitter. Imagine someone who's an Iraqi who's born in 1990 or 1991. They've known nothing but war and what do you say, embargo. So this is an important for context, because a lot of the time the Western world is very happy to call us their heroes when we protest, and then ignore us completely when we're actually in trouble. A good example of this is our late friend Raed Faris, Syrian journalist and Syrian activist who was killed in November. It's not clear yet who killed him, but we think it is militants associated with Al-Qaeda. A man who is hated by Assad and hated by ISIS and hated by Al-Qaeda. A man who is sometimes celebrated and sometimes ignored by international media. This is unfortunately the reality that we live with. And I'll leave it to my colleagues to comment on the other questions.
I have a problem with asking what is the West going to do for us, simply because I do not hold them to be morally, for examples like Iraq. How to have better foreign policy? I don't fucking care. I think what they should do is stop selling weapons to the rest of the world. They just should stop selling weapons, period. They should stop making weapons. I also speak as an American, and so there's a lot of conflicting. Our foreign policy is bullshit when it comes to we care about human rights, we care about democracy, we care about things. We don't. We simply care about preserving our own interests in these countries. And so to me, I don't look towards the West to save us in the airboat. Sorry, two hats. And so to me, it's we are the only people who can save ourselves. In Syria and Palestine, in Saudi and Bahrain and Yemen. And this is, I think, the reality that we live in. I mean, I think the Palestinians learned this before anyone else, because they used to ask, where are the Arabs? And I think no Palestinian asks where the Arabs are anymore. And that's a sad thing, but this is the reality. And so the foreign policy, I'm very skeptical about that it is an internal, it's an internal struggle that Americans, British, Europeans in general need to have on their own, and they need to stop the hypocrisy of their own foreign policy and pretending they give a shit. They don't, and we should stop expecting them to give a shit. Does that cover everyone?
I think you're asking about Saddam Hussein. It's right, but don't put it in the right time. The people, when they disappointing and be hopeless for anybody help them, when all the world collect or together push the situation in Syria and others to be fight between Shia and Sunnah and others, the people start to cry, Ya Allah, malna ghairak ya Allah. We don't have else God to help us, when nobody help them. In fact, that describe why the people reach to be run away from dictatorship to put another dictatorship to support or to headline. For what the West can do, yes, it's many or so important question, and we faced it all the time. We need just to catch your principle and defense about it. You believe with human rights, you believe with justice, okay. Don't deal with any kind of way with criminals, and specific criminals against humanity.
But Anwar, they're criminals themselves. This is
No,
why
I speak about West,
No, but in the West,
No,
right?
no,
When you're
it's-
supporting dictatorships, when
that-
you're arming them to the
that-
teeth,
that-
and
that
then
what-
pretends like, oh, why are you
That's
killing
what
each
I
other?
spoke. We don't want or ask for military intervention. Just catch your principle. Don't deal with any kind of way with criminals against humanity and war crimes. That's very simple thing. Next, all the West deal with the refugees issue as a humanitarian need. Okay, they need food, they need home, they need, okay, we will. In fact, if you will look to this, when this side, they help the criminals. Bashar al-Assad pushed the Syrian outside Syria, okay, don't care, we will take them and put them. They deal with the issue with the humanitarian, not as politic. We don't need to be here as refugees. We need our home, our country be safe and secure for us. That's what we need you to help us. I like Europe to come as visitors, as partners, but I don't like to be here as refugees. And all the Syrians and others, I think they feel like that. Help us to back to our home, secure and safe, to feel our humanity in our countries. Don't deal with us, oh, people poor and need food. No, we are not like that. We left, all the Syrians left money, left homes, left business, and run away from arrest. Until now, 150,000 people disappeared in Syrian regime detention. At least 70,000 of them died already from torture and conditioner of. Help us to beg. I like, and all the Syrian, everybody like to be here as visitor, okay? But we like more, we love to be in our country. Help us to be safe, to have life like your life, not under dictatorship, threat us every second, arrested or killed, or with barrel bomb, or with plane attacked, or chemical weapon. So it's so important, no deal with any criminals that it can do. Thank you very much, sorry.
So we run out of time. Thank you very much, and of course the panel is not the Arab Winter anymore, but this is Saura Mustamera panel, The Revolution Continues. Thank you very much.